It's almost 4 weeks since Harold Camping's prediction that the world would end was proved to, well, not quite be right. Now, you might argue that he's not necessarily an expert, but it turns out that even those we charge with running countries don't always get their predictions of the future quite right either.
I don't think there'll be a woman Prime Minister in my lifetime, as far as I can see.
We will not return to boom and bust.
And this will shock you, I know, but the Radio 4 crystal ball doesn't even always work for all presenters here. And I'm sure Justin Webb and Evan Davis won't mind us playing this from 2007, when Stephen Sacker asked the correspondents to make some political predictions.
Who is going to win the White House, the presidential election? James, let's start with you.
A hunch, Barack Obama.
Obama. Liz?
Hillary Clinton.
Justin?
John McCain.
Wow.
I was going to say John McCain. I didn't think Justin was going to say John McCain. That was mine. I was going to say none of the above, and I was going to say John McCain.
Now, we all know no one can possibly know for certain what's going to happen in the future. So why is it that we carry on asking experts for their predictions? What is it psychologically that makes us so desperate to believe in them? Dan Gardner is the author of Future Babble, Why Expert Predictions Fail and Why We Believe Them Anyway. And Dylan Evans is a lecturer in behavioural science at Cork University, and he's researching how to train people to assess risk more accurately. I began by asking Dan Gardner just how wrong experts have got it in the past.
Oh, sure. There's an endless litany of failed predictions. In fact, you could fill a whole library with nothing but failed predictions. Some of them are famous, such as the many experts who said that there would never again be another major European war shortly before the First World War broke out. There was Irving Fisher, the great American economist, who said that in 1929, of course, stocks had reached a permanently high plateau shortly before the crash. There was a virtual expert consensus in the late 1980s and early 1990s that Japan would overtake the United States and become the world's #1 economy. Like I say, it's an endless litany.
I liked the experiment that The Economist did in the 1980s with various former finance ministers, company chairmen and dustmen, and they got them to give 10-year economic forecasts, and the finance ministers didn't come out very well, but the dustmen did just as well as the company chairman. So is there just not such a thing as an expert, really?
Well, I don't go that far. I don't want to be cynical. I don't want to say that experts know nothing. I think that's a terrible mistake. But it is true that prediction of the sort that we're interested in, predicting economies, predicting elections, wars, it's extremely difficult. And simply being an expert in the subject is no guarantee of accuracy. By the way, I should, of course, mention that while it's easy for me to run off a list of examples of failed expert predictions, of course, I haven't actually proved my point that expert predictions routinely fail by simply telling you anecdotes. In order to do that, what you have to do is you have to have an experiment. You have to have quite an elaborate and exhaustive experiment, in which, fortunately, it's already been done. It's been done by an eminent psychologist named Philip Tetlock. Philip Tetlock brought together a group of about 280 experts. They were economists, political scientists, intelligence analysts, journalists, people whose job involved forecasting to some degree. And he asked them about 28,000 predictions in all, about all the sorts of things that they make predictions about anyway, the economy, the inflation rate, elections, wars. And so time passed, he analyzed the accuracy of the predictions, and he came to the conclusion that the average expert was about as accurate as random guessing, or if you prefer a more colorful metaphor, about as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee. Cynics like to emphasize that first conclusion of Tetlock's research, that the average expert was no better than a flipped coin. But they don't emphasize the second point. I think the second point's just as important, perhaps even more important, which is that there was actually two statistically significant groups of experts. One group was actually less accurate than random guessing. They actually would have improved their outcomes if they had flipped a coin. But the other group had real predictive insight. Now, it was modest predictive insight. They were still miles and miles and miles from perfect, but they had real predictive insight. And that is a real interesting illustration of a critical point.
Well, so Dylan, if I can bring you in here, what do you think that does mean? Does that mean there are a few people who just happen to have a genius for prediction, or are some people using different strategies?
Well, I think that Tetlock's, he draws a distinction between what he calls foxes and hedgehogs, and that there does seem to be a different kind of style of thinking in some experts, which is much more cautious and humble, if you like. And these people, which Tetlock calls the foxes, tend to be a lot better at making predictions than the hedgehogs. There are a few groups of people who do remarkably well at predictions, and for example, there are sort of odd little groups like US weather forecasters tend to be really good, whereas British ones not so good. And this isn't just because British weather is less predictable, it's because the US weather forecasters are firstly, they're making their predictions in numerical terms. They're saying there's a 40% or 50% chance of rainfall. And secondly, they're getting regular and precise feedback, and that seems to be the crucial element.
I mean, Dan, it's easy for us to say all the experts are no good at it, but we're the ones who believe them and who go back to them for more advice and who get people to make these predictions in the first place. We want our politicians to be able to tell us what will happen. Isn't it our fault?
Oh, absolutely. It's a demand-side problem. Human beings have a fundamental psychological aversion to uncertainty. It's extremely disturbing, particularly in uncertain times, to look into the future and realize you don't know what's coming next. And so you go looking for certainty in various places. For example, there is research that shows that belief in superstition rises during particularly uncertain times. Well, another form of certainty is, of course, the expert prediction. If you believe the expert knows what's going to come, then you can derive certainty from his or her prediction. That's very psychologically satisfying. But here's the tricky part. The sort of expert who is extremely confident that they know what's going to come is, as demonstrated in Philip Tetlock's research, precisely the sort of expert that we should not be listening to. They're the sort of expert who is most likely to be wrong. It's the type of expert who says, I think on a balance of probabilities that is more likely than not that something is going to happen, but I can see countervailing factors. In other words, it's the sort of expert who gives you that very dissatisfying response, that very hedged response. Who is more likely to be right? They don't satisfy our psychological craving for certainty, and so we tend not to seek them out, and that's a terrible mistake.
So in a sense, we need to stop believing the people who say that they're certain and start believing the people who are uncertain instead.
Absolutely. In fact, in Philip Tetlock's research, he showed that there was an inverse correlation between fame and accuracy. The more famous the expert was, the less accurate he was. And that's because the media and the public are turning to the wrong sorts of experts. You can test this yourself by asking yourself, when you listen to talking heads on the radio, on television, how often do you hear the phrase, I don't know? Well, we know from the research literature that saying I don't know, acknowledging the limitations of your knowledge, is absolutely essential to good judgment, and yet you never hear that. That's a mistake.
So, Dylan, can people be taught to be better forecasters? Can we improve on the forecasts that we make?
I think we can. The groups that do seem to be particularly good at this have a number of characteristics in common. One, get used to putting their forecasts in probabilistic terms rather than categorical terms. They say, there's a 30 or 40% chance of something happening rather than it will or it won't happen. And they get regular feedback. It may be possible to construct training programs that would build on that. In fact, in Royal Dutch Shell in the 1970s, the geologists were making overconfident predictions about the likelihood of finding oil. And they did construct a training program along those lines, which seemed to make them much better and much more accurate in their predictions. So there is some hope that it can be done. But it's early days, I think.
And in fact, Philip Tetlock is actually working on precisely what you're describing, sort of advancing exactly that sort of research to see if there's some way to actually train people to think more like foxes and improve their judgment.
Dan Gardner and Dylan Evans.